Thank you, Patrick, very much, and thank you for your warm welcome, and even more, thank you for being here and for being part of our effort to make the United Nations what it should be and what we all intended. And indeed, without the help and support and backing and interest and work of all of you, we would not be where we are today or where we expect and hope to be in the days ahead. Before I talk about the United Nations in peace and security, which is principally the Security Council, let me just say that I know that you've talked over priorities today, and I don't want to intrude myself in priorities, but I'd like to say that the Law of the Sea Treaty, in which I had the pleasure of working many years ago from this building, and the ongoing negotiations on Iran are certainly things that require attention and interest, and indeed on the Hill, I hope that they will see an outpouring of interest in these subjects as well as all of the other subjects that you have agreed that you will do advocacy on. They both require now some hard work because they are engaged in. They both require hard work because there's essentially too much misunderstanding and too much misinformation about them. But the negotiations on Iran are critically important to see whether that issue can be solved without entering into another war in the Middle East, something that I think our national population, and they think about it, would be totally against. And the Law of the Sea Treaty is absolutely critical for 1,001 things. But it happens to be the only treaty I know of that is supported from the Pentagon clear across to the environmental movement and back. And those who seem to oppose it seem to be living in a different world and talking about a different treaty. So with those warm words of appreciation in advance, let me then turn to the subject that you have asked me to speak about, and which I want very much to speak about because I spent a certain number of years, I don't usually say before anybody in this room was born, but certain about a number of years ago at the United Nations, engaging in the Security Council. The United Nations Charter makes special reference to threats to peace and security, and the shapers and formers of the Charter, many of whom were our fellow Americans, believed very much in the midst and at the end of the Second World War that it was the primary duty of the World Organization to save mankind from the scourge of war. We have not been successful in that endeavor, but I believe that much has been done through the United Nations and the Security Council to head off war, to end wars, to deal with the question of peacekeeping, which is a major contribution to stopping fighting and beginning rebuilding and reconstruction, and indeed working toward new political arrangements to replace conflict as the arbiter of man's differences. It is also important to know that where it has fallen short, it has not been that necessarily the organization has been at fault so much as its members, but the structure is being talked about, and I want to talk about the Security Council, its performance, and some of the things that I believe we should all be thinking about for the future of the Security Council. Peace and security and threats to peace and security are not static, and the organizations that we put together and the efforts we devote to deal with those problems should not themselves be static. You all know that the Charter provided for a Security Council that was unusual in a sense that all of its predecessors at the League and in other efforts were bodies that made recommendations. The Security Council, first and foremost, although many members have tended to forget this, is a body that can speak in what we like to call a mandatory voice. It can not just ask states, but states, by dint of their signing on the Charter, are expected to comply with the decisions of the Security Council when they're made in a particular legal format. And that's obviously to send the clear message that this decision is important, that the Council believes that it should be obeyed and followed, and generally speaking, that has happened. There are times when some of us have been concerned, both times when I served on the council and times subsequently, when we had to be careful that the council did not call and no one would come, if I could put it that way. We had to be very careful that we were dealing with solutions to the problems that in Maine could command not just 9 of the 15 votes in the Security Council, but a large majority of the members of the organization itself would themselves be supportive and in favor of the general elements of a solution or a set of actions the Security Council wished them to take to bring about peace and security. And this is quite important. It is also important to know, and I'll try to touch on this in a little more detail, that over the years, as with all constitutions, there are strict constructionists with respect to the Charter, and there are liberal constructionists with respect to the Charter. The liberal constructionists believe that once the Council decides, that's it. And the strict constructionists believe that the Council should only make decisions that have to do specifically with solving the problem with which they have been seized, the current problem on the agenda. And the differences are these, that the Council has made many decisions on particular questions all around the world. But in the 1990s and beyond, it also began to make general decisions. All states should report to the organization on the steps and methods they have taken to deal with terrorism. A perfectly logical, reasonable, indeed important objective. But it does go beyond solving a particular problem, terrorism in country X, the effects of 9/11, and so on, and takes it into the realm of general legislation. And so some have been concerned that the Security Council not become a general legislative body for the world community, where it might, for example, take important steps in interpreting treaties or indeed adding to treaties, and that it stick with the narrower brief. This, I think, will continue to be something on the agenda. It is not yet widely thought about enough, in my view, but we need people to be aware of it. Because, in effect, over time, in a number of subject areas in which there has been wide but not universal approval of certain kinds of actions, some of them reporting, some of them of a more general application with respect to the actions of states, the Security Council has run into the realm that maybe not everybody will follow the call. And the worst thing that could happen to the Security Council is that it become, in effect, an organization full of sound and fury signifying nothing. And we need to worry about that, and it's an issue. Secondly, I think it is important to know that the Council is, of course, made up of 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members. There were 5 permanent members in the original Council, and in the 1960s, a smaller number of non-permanent members, 6, was enlarged to 10. The non-permanent members, as you know, are elected for 2-year terms, 5 every year, and they are apportioned by region of the world so that there is wide representation, and that the regional bodies which have been informally formed but now increasingly formally recognized have often resolved among themselves who from that region will have the next turn on the Security Council. And it is only in the Western European and others, which includes us, that there is often a vote. Of course, we're a permanent member, so we never get subject to a vote. We're there all of the time. But it is interesting to note, because I want to talk about council enlargement, the history of the council and a little bit of the arrangements for the council. From time to time, where we and others have had objections to the selection of a state on the rota principle by a regional group, Cuba, or sometimes another state whose reputation for being seriously devoted to the world interest in bringing about peace and security and dealing with threats to peace and security has been less than sterling. We have worked with others, in fact, to promote an election, to see, in fact, whether a more deserving and perhaps more worthy representative of the region could come on the council. We need to be careful, obviously, that we are not seen as packing the council, something we have been accused of. We have not done a lot of that recently, but that's something that was in play very much in the council's history. Let me also say that the history of the council has followed the history of the world. And for its first 50 years in the midst of the Cold War, it was somewhat chained, but not totally irrelevant. But my first month in New York, the Security Council had no meetings, none at all. A year and a half later, after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, we met frequently, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. Not necessarily in formal meetings, but often in informal meetings where a great deal of work is done. The council is organized so that the council has a president who is from among its members. The presidents come in alphabetical order, the English alphabetical order of the way in which they sit at the tables of the Security Council, so there's no election. And almost everybody gets a turn to be president, although some may escape that, but in a 2-year period, it's most likely that even a non-permanent member will be 1 or 2 times president of the council. The president of the council leads the work, but has no unusual powers, although it was a labor of Hercules on my part to discourage the State Department from believing that when I was president of the council, I had some almighty powers over running things. And indeed, if in fact presidents of the council acted in ways that were too peremptory, they got slapped down. And no president, in my view, ever wanted to maneuver themselves into that position, even if Washington thought it was the best of all possible options. The council in the post-Cold War period, I think, went through a fairly euphoric phase for a very short period of time, and I happened to be present in New York when that happened, mainly stimulated by Iraq's unexpected and untoward and happily unprofitable invasion of Kuwait on the 1st of August of 1990. When the council went into meeting at midnight on that day to deal with the issue and stayed with it until the end of November. The council, first and foremost, asked and told Iraq in a mandatory voice to withdraw, and when it didn't, it passed a series of resolutions, a good portion of which were escalating sanctions to see if pressure could be brought on Iraq to get it to withdraw from Kuwait. It was a time when Iraq was an ideal enemy. My strategy in the council was, until we passed the use of force resolution at the end of November, to always have the council focused on Iraq. It was the one way that we could mold and strengthen them and support them in their effort to become, at least momentarily, what looked for a moment in the press, at least, as the most important club in the world to belong to. And it meant, in fact, that it helped us with our efforts to persuade them to move from resolution to resolution. And while there were times I thought that we would have to engage playwrights and others to assist us inventing new resolutions, it was never the case. Saddam Hussein, day after day, provided us with new reasons to bring the council together to deal with his outrageous actions. The work of the council in those days was threatened from time to time by people in a hurry who didn't want to wait another 24 hours for the Council to act. Happily, I worked for a president who had been the U.S. representative to the United Nations and a Secretary of State, George Herbert Walker Bush and James Baker, who understood the political value of having the Council, and indeed, the work of the Council turned out to be enormously valuable when President Bush had to consider with the Congress what we would do when sanctions did not produce the results we had hoped for and had to use military force to remove Iraqi forces from Kuwait. And at that period, it became very important for a number of members of the Senate that, in fact, there were 12 Council resolutions on the books asking for a particular objective, and indeed that the Council itself, all of its members, had by a significant vote approved the need for the use of force if Iraq did not comply with the work of the Council. It was a fascinating period. The Council took all of the steps that were envisaged in the Charter, including up to and including the notion that if there was not Iraqi compliance by a date certain, some 45 days after the resolution was passed, that the coalition supporting Kuwait and the liberation of Kuwait was authorized to use all necessary means to achieve that objective. That, of course, prefigured the use of force, and the coalition states had told us they were prepared to do so. That went through quite a long air campaign and a very short ground campaign, blessedly. It ended with an Iraqi compliance, the removal of whatever remaining forces they had, while most of their forces had been driven out. And then the Council took on another job, a very interesting one, and one that was not, in my view, ever before considered by the Security Council, what to do to terminate the conflict. Conflicts ended often with peace treaties, but not always. But in fact, it passed a very long and very complex resolution, which it adopted from the point of view of the Council and the international community a number of innovative steps to end the conflict, including setting up a commission to use oil revenues from Iraq to compensate people who were victims of the war in one way or another, for the return of prisoners and stolen property from Kuwait, most importantly, perhaps, for the setting up under the United Nations of a special commission to continue to inspect Iraq with respect to weapons of mass destruction and to make frequent reports. And indeed it did. And it did, in my view, a thorough and practical and serious job. It was headed first by a Swede with an American deputy, and it had plenty of opportunities for confrontation with Saddam and his people, but it received the continuous support of the world community and the Security Council in its efforts. That was very, very important and marked a new watershed. I say all of this because then we moved on to deal with Somalia and with the breakup of Yugoslavia, and we did a lot less well. It was a lot more confusing. There were significant political interests on both sides of the issue. We took a position very early on with respect to Yugoslavia that it should not break up. And with regard to Somalia, which had entered into anarchy and lawlessness, we felt increasingly that the United Nations, and then when it had difficulty in dealing with those who would attack it, the United States should engage themselves in a very serious way to bring about law and order. We failed. The Council failed to see, in fact, that the model of Iraq and Kuwait was not the kind of model that was necessarily going to work in a clear and straightforward way in Somalia and in ex-Yugoslavia. And for 10 years, we struggled with ex-Yugoslavia. I'm happy to say that while they are not totally out of the woods, it has emerged in a situation in which the terrors and horrors of the past have been put behind them. Those responsible for crimes in the main have been brought before the International Criminal Court, and people are struggling not only to get along, they have become members of the United Nations, and they are going to be soon, in some cases, members of the European Union. Somalia remains different. Somalia is still a hotbed of anarchy. Several small successor states have emerged without a great deal of international recognition. And increasingly, a peacekeeping force made up of Burundi and Uganda, supported by Kenya and Ethiopia, have begun to try to reestablish law and order in the capital and nearby. But it will be a long, hard, and messy struggle. And there are no easy solutions. The Security Council, I believe, has worked hard and tried its best to assist. And we know that there are now very difficult problems. Libya, which seems to have gone through the military phase only to consternate us all with a great deal of uncertainty in what we would have to call the rebuilding and reestablishment phase. And Syria, which hasn't gone through any phase except getting worse day by day, remains a huge challenge to all of us. The answer, of course, is that the Security Council alone cannot solve these questions, and it is heavily incumbent upon its members to play a constructive and useful role. And we have seen differences, particularly over Syria, between Russia and China, and the United States and France and Britain, and indeed, I believe, the majority of the rest of the Council and the Arab League continue to make that a very difficult problem to solve. The Council has, of course, seen successes and failures. It continues to exist. If we hadn't gotten it, we would have had to invent it. But there have been lots of suggestions for change, certainly beginning before I went to New York in 1989. Some of those suggestions for change have taken the form of enlarging the membership. One simple idea, which has certainly gotten hold, is that there are a number of large countries, not victors in the Second World War, who ought to be permanent members because of their size or their population or their potential to make real contributions to the work of the United Nations. On the list are Japan and India, and Brazil possibly, and Germany, and maybe some others, South Africa or Nigeria. A number of other countries who are competitors in their own way of some of these states would like to be on, and if they can't be on, they will do their damnedest to make sure that their competitors don't get on. This is a world of tough politics, and that's certainly the way the situation is going. Once you talk about adding new permanent members, two other issues raise their heads. What about the non-permanent members? After all, 10 countries now represent, what are we at, 193 members of the organization? They represent, if my math is right, 188 other countries, while the 5 chosen ones stay on permanently. So there is a real question. Do we have, in fact, a body that adequately represents the organization? Certainly, in terms of real democracy, probably not. On the other hand, it was envisaged that the Security Council had to be small enough to act rapidly and have enough significant representation of the muscle team to be able either to frighten or actually use its strength to support its decisions. And that's why, of course, the veto is there. The United States and the Soviet Union, now Russia, and others were not prepared to accept an organization where the collective strength of the organization could be used against American interests. The enshrinement of particularism in a special way, for good or ill. So there's a question of, if there are new permanent members, should they have the veto? And there's a question, if there are new permanent members, how many non-permanent members should be there? The U.S. over the years has taken several positions. It supported, one time or another, most of the aspirants in one way or another for permanent membership, but on a separate and essentially non-programmatic, if I can put it this way, basis from time to time. And it has supported the idea that perhaps the Council might eventually end up with 22 or 24 members, depending on how many permanent members join. Non-permanent members might also join them in a way that was not exactly proportional, but it was not exactly disrespectful of the notion that there should be more non-permanent members. I think that it is also important to notice that in order to do all of this, serious, significant votes are required. You have to overcome the veto in the Security Council. If my recollection is correct, 2/3 of the members of the General Assembly have to support charter change, which this would involve. And because the charter is a treaty, I think they require 2/3 of the member states to ratify a new charter series of amendments in order to get this to accomplish. And while some countries, Britain, for example, can ratify by an executive branch act, many countries have to take ratifications to their parliament. So you can see that probably this is only 3 times harder than amending the American Constitution when you look at it. So it's not going to happen right away. What can happen, in my view, very practically and very usefully, is that 2 or 3 things might sort of move ahead here. One is that members who are putative new permanent members might serve more frequently than they would by a kind of general rotating principle. And that's beginning to happen. That those states might also be encouraged not only to participate, but perhaps to take a more open and supportive view of their contributions to the organization and their peacekeeping contributions, and indeed engaging themselves more in that line of work. I think it is also very important that the existing permanent members perhaps move. And while we have, over the past, and particularly within the last 20 years, been very chary about involving ourselves in UN peacekeeping, I think there are many things we could do. We used to be heavily relied upon for air support. We used to be heavily relied upon for technical support in places where the UN was not able or fully prepared to provide the mechanisms. Right now, I would suppose that fully 2/3, or maybe a number equally large, of UN peacekeepers come from South Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, and to some extent Nepal. For some of states, peacekeeping serves a lucrative function. But for some states, it also is an enshrinement of their commitment to the organization, and they are proud of their military forces, and they can perform. I think that over time, we need to give careful thought to another aspect of the Security Council in terms of membership increase. Europe, if it continues to exist financially and economically, and I have no sense that anything I say here will have any market impact, will certainly want to strengthen and improve its capacity to have a common defense and security policy. If it does, if it reaches that near nirvana, then maybe we can take an old Italian suggestion, which was more Machiavellian than anything else, that there be one representative of the European community in the Security Council. Maybe that would work over time, and maybe that would open the door. So rather than adding another European or two, we might subtract 1 or 2. But since they have a common endeavor in this particular part of the world, I am sure they could work out among themselves when they get to that nirvana-like state who it is would represent them in New York. Beyond that, I don't know of any easy theories for the answer. It has also been my view for some time, and it's a view that were I here in an official capacity, I probably would eschew even breathing a word about. But it's something we need to look at. The veto is not an unlimited good for the United States. If you look at the times when the veto has been cast in issues of significance to us, and most importantly to the international community, on questions of genocide, where the Council has been blocked from action by a veto, it has not been ours, and it has generally meant that the Council and the international community have been less effective than they might be or should be in dealing with those human tragedies that we label genocide. And it would be something in our own interest to look at to see, in fact, if there were some formula that could be arrived at. My own view is, unless 3 members of the Security Council object to a resolution on genocide, the others ought to hold their nose and abstain and let it go through. But it could be 2 as well, and that would be an improvement. That isn't going to happen, not in this day and age. It was a millennial thought some decades ago, and maybe we had the persuasive capacity to move it in that direction. But ideas along those lines might also be helpful in dealing. After all, the veto was put in to protect vital interests of the permanent members. It's been exercised in the main, but not always, to protect trivial interests and send diplomatic messages, or indeed to disrupt actions that might have involved the international community more forcefully in dealing with tragic circumstances about to unfold or already having unfolded. And one should find a way to distinguish those cases and perhaps get back to what could best be expressed as the original intention of the founders of the Charter. I'm going to now, in a minute or two, turn it over to you, because while I usually get paid by the minute, this is a free speech. There's another thing that I think can happen with peace and security in the Security Council, and it has to do with where and how the Security Council interrelates, as it rarely does, with the rest of the functioning of the organization, and that's in the election of the Secretary General. I say this now, and I said it 20 years ago, and it has nothing to do with any individual personality, but everything to do with what I hope one could do to make the position of Secretary General and the incumbent as strong and as useful and as forceful and as strongly backed as we possibly could. Right now, the Secretary General is elected on what the British like to call the principle of Bloggin's turn. We have an informal arrangement, which has now been semi-formalized, that each region of the world gets a turn to elect a Secretary General. Not each gender, not necessarily each color, not necessarily each major language, each region. And I'd like to see it opened up. And I'd like to see us get rid of Bloggin's turn. Asia's now in its 2nd cycle, but maybe we could end it here. If we ended it 8 years ago, we would have ended it with a turn for everybody in the regions, but now we're in a 2nd cycle, and it would be a disaster, in my view, to continue with the 2nd cycle, that we need to open it up in a way that gives more capacity for strong and good people to run and more opportunities. One way to do this, only one way to do this, is for the Security Council, which in fact has to make the nominations to the General Assembly, perhaps to invite 5, 7, 9, an odd number of former heads of state that represent diversity in all of its aspects, to become a nominating committee, not the exclusive source of new candidates, but perhaps an alternative source of good candidates, to put before the Security Council a list that is not, in my view, easily vetoable by the home state, which has happened to some good candidates in the past, because they were out of sorts politically with their home government. I'd like to see a major effort made in the next Secretary General to get gender diversity. I think women have a role and indeed an obligation to be part of the leadership of the World Organization, and I'm happy to say that the first Deputy Secretary General was a woman from Canada. But over time, those roles have grown, but we still think in terms of this, at least up until now, to be exclusively a men's club. And men's clubs are gone out of fashion long since in many places around the world. And I think it's important that we look for greater diversity, not just regional diversity, but other kinds of diversity in skills and capabilities. And to exclude half of the human race or more is nutty. Just by excluding on a regional basis another 3/4 of the human race is nutty. And so why can't we, in fact, have something that really does seek to achieve excellence and that we have confidence that it can, and the Security Council is being pushed, obviously, in that direction to move that way? Well, those are some thoughts. The Security Council needs to be strengthened. It needs to have wisdom to protect its decisions. It needs to understand that when it calls, people will come. It needs to act in a way that is forward-leaning, but not so out of balance that it destroys itself. And over a period of time, it needs to understand that its highest callings are to deal with threats to peace and security, to protect human life, to stop conflict, and to do all the things of a preventive character that can make that happen. Whether that is in calling upon states to protect their own citizens, because many states are perhaps the greatest violators of the principles of the Charter with their own people, or whether it is dealing with failed and failing states where conflict has become inevitable, or the growing sense that we have around the world that ethnic and tribal allegiances predominate and have to become part of strife in the world to have people feel safe and secure in their own homelands. These are all significant and important questions. Those of you who look at the United Nations as you do, as the best that we have been able to do, but know, in fact, as I know in my heart, that it can do better and that it can be supported for doing better, ought to continue to give a hard look to the Security Council and where it might go. And thank you so much for your time and attention. I know the struggle after lunch in listening to long-winded speeches, but I hope that you can wake each other up with some fascinating questions. Thank you. We're all going to get marks on our questions here, so be careful.
So we'll move across the room. I saw a hand over here first. Please use the microphone so everyone can hear.
This is Karen Mulhauser from the National Capital Area, and I thought I'd already heard your best set of remarks, and now you have a new best set of remarks. I do have just a comment on one somewhat recent UN reform issue, and that is the establishment of UN Women, the collapsing of some programs, and I'd be interested in hearing your remarks about that. And more than specifically, 12 years ago, the UN Security Council unanimously passed Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. And our country finally got around to writing its national action plan. And I'd be curious what you think are the hopes of our government's national action plan actually being implemented in a way that would have an impact.
Well, I begin by saying you know my views.
Yeah.
Secondly, I hope that the Secretary can get the CEDAW signed up to by the United States. It seems to have fallen in line maybe behind Law of the Sea, maybe behind Comprehensive Test Ban, but I hope it doesn't go too far down the line. My own sense is that the organization should be paying serious attention to the role and status of women. That doesn't mean exclusivity. It means, in my view, appropriate attention and balance. I don't know, and I'm sorry to say I don't, but I've been out of this building for 12 years, what the action plan provides. But I hope we're living up to our action plan. Otherwise, why prepare it? But if any of you have any advice for me in that regard that I can press home with the 4 people still living in this building who remember me, I will do it.
Yes.
Nominate some women for those top positions, please, because you still know.
I think it's a good idea, and I'd be happy to work on it with you.
Jeff?
Tom, you began your remarks by noting your hope that for action on law of the sea, which is on the agenda that people are taking onto the Hill tomorrow, but you also mentioned Iran and the nuclear negotiations. And once folks have gone through their checklist, those who might be interested in raising the Iran question, I wonder if you could suggest a 1 to 2 line kind of question that they might pose to their interlocutor. And then vaguely related, what are your views on the inclusion or exclusion of Iran from Kofi Annan's proposed contact group to flog new life into the Syria peace initiative?
I think that I would, rather than pose questions to people on the Hill, tell them what I think. And I think that's what they're more interested in. So if you have to go through the diplomatic dance of using questions to tell them what you think, that's okay. But I would like to have you tell them, I think that the President's adoption of a diplomatic solution to the Iran problem, both nuclear and non-nuclear, and both are important, is very significant and very important. You hope that the United States and others will go to the talks in Moscow to lead in the effort to find a solution, and that the positions that we will put forward will in fact reflect our interests, but also the principles we just agreed to of step-by-step and reciprocity, and doing it all in the context of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, all of which I think fully protect our position. But I think that both sides, and the Iranians are no angels here, are putting forward positions which basically are what we used to call in diplomacy a horse for a rabbit deal. And we all know horses for rabbits is not necessarily one you're going to get an easy, quick answer on. But I think we ought to move away from horses for rabbits, maybe horses for horses. So I think that's significant, Jeff, and I hope that we will do that. Tell me what the second part of your question was again. I got so enthused about the first part.
Inclusion or exclusion of Iran from the Syria contact?
You know, this building, for reasons that they have decided, thinks that Iran is perhaps a bigger troublemaker than a resolver. On the other hand, Iran has perhaps more influence on the Syrians. The really interesting question is, are the Iranians prepared to support Kofi Annan's efforts? And if Kofi can come forward and say, look, I've talked to the Iranians, they're behind my efforts, they're going to support it, and I can enlist them in pushing the Syrians, then I would say go. But if he isn't able to do that, then to bring another troublemaker into the midst of something that is already remarkably unharmonious is probably not a wise idea politically or diplomatically. The fact that he's suggesting it ought to suggest to us that we ought to make sure, in fact, that that's what he really means, and that he believes that, in fact, they can be helpful in getting a solution he supports.
Bill?
Bill Haas, Southwest Connecticut chapter. I just wanted to say that when I worked at the United Nations, I saw a lot of UN ambassadors, and Ambassador Pickering was one of the finest that we had at the UN. I remember being a first-hand witness to his handling of things in the Council during the Iraq-Kuwait episode. So,
Well, thank you, Bill, very much.
And I just wanted to follow up a little bit on the Syrian question, because I think this is a very knotty problem, and there's so much division about it. It kind of reminds me of what happened with Kosovo, where the council was deadlocked, nothing could be done, and finally the NATO had to do something outside the UN framework, which was unfortunate, but maybe sometimes necessary. And I was wondering if you had any comments or suggestions about where we can go from here, or what do you think, how the U.S. can proceed in this diplomatic environment to get this resolved, because people are dying every day.
Well, I strongly support what we have been doing in an attempt to support Kofi and to bring greater pressures to bear on the Syrian government, while at the same time we use all of our efforts to make sure the opposition doesn't become the bigger problem. My feeling is that we might think about moving in the direction of a quarantine of some kind, an isolation of Syria, perhaps physically, maybe by sea, maybe beginning, and maybe we'd have to end there, with an effort to assure that Syria's major source of income from petroleum exports stays in Syria for a while. But I don't know beyond that. I mean, you could talk about air blockades or air quarantines as well as sea and land quarantines, and some of the neighbors might be prepared to assist. I doubt that Iraq would be, and that would be a problem. So this is something that I don't think is a quick silver bullet ready to hand, but it's another step along the path that we have laid out short of military engagement, which I think we and others are very carefully, hopefully concerned about in a very serious way, that it not produce a bigger disaster than is already there. On the other hand, that if more of murdering his own people continues to be the policy of Saddam, wrong guy, Assad, then I have only one enemy at a time, unfortunately. Then we need to think about what we can do. Others have proposed safe havens, and if they can be done comfortably along the border without conflict, that might help. Others have proposed increased humanitarian assistance, and I think that goes without saying. I think that others should be helping, as I believe they are, with the refugees who have moved into the neighboring countries. I think over a period of time, if the refugees feel they can't go back or never go back, that should be a help. My own feeling is that we should be making all the possible approaches through people who have contacts with them, with the Alawite minority, which is currently what, in fact, it bolsters the Assad family, but begin to tell them that this is not a ethnic war against them, that those who are, in fact, bystanders and not participants in criminal activity can expect and will get protection in the future rather than necessarily see themselves only as the future victims of a future non-Alawite, non-Assad government of Syria. And we need as well to work with all of the other participants to support the outcome so they don't jump off what it is that Kofi Annan has put together and hopes to achieve, certainly as long as that has any possibility of being viable. I think finally, Russia and China, in a way, have assumed by their veto a special responsibility for the failure of the Council to be able to act effectively to support Kofi Annan. They've both said they support Kofi Annan. Now I think we need to continue to challenge them, as the Secretary did 2 weeks ago, to meet that test. In fact, to say that it is not a free ride, that you can decide against anything in the Council, but you're no longer held accountable for it, or you no longer have any authority. And indeed, I would say to them that having done the veto, you've now incurred this wonderful, cozy relationship with President Assad. Go use that relationship to see if you can help solve the problem along the lines you purport to support.
Michael?
As members, we all support the mission of the Organization for Strong U.S. Leadership in the United Nations. And as an example of a strong leader, I'm wondering if you could give us your vision or your definition of what strong U.S. leadership can be and will be in the future.
Sure. I think it involves policy choices that can help make the UN effective, and to the greatest extent possible that we and the choices the UN eventually goes with get as close together as we can so that we avoid cross-roughs that tear things apart. It means, as we have done, picking people to represent us. It means, in fact, having an organization in this building and in the government which reminds on a regular basis of the opportunities and indeed the work that can be done through the UN to achieve our objectives. The UN is an enormous multiplier. It, in fact, when it decides on behalf of the international community, lines up the international community with a set of objectives and policies that I believe can be very useful. The U.S. has been, in my view, remarkably successful in the main. There are areas and times when we've had differences, but remarkably successful in being at one with the UN and working effectively. This doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen because you were particularly inspired in the shower in the morning to select a set of policy options that necessarily the rest of the world is going to agree to. So we have to have strong backing for that. We have to pay our requirements, as everybody else does, to keep the organization moving and alive. We have to spend time on thinking how it could be improved and support those efforts, and I believe we have been doing that. We have to know and understand where the future of peacekeeping can take us and how we can support where it's come, but maybe in a way for the future, see if it can be made even more effective than it is now. We have to help the UN clean up its faults. Like any bureaucracy and organization, it makes mistakes, and some are doozies. And we have to help it deal with that, just as we do inside our own government and in our own cities and states in every other way. We have to remain alert to that, but we don't have to sink the ship because it has a small hole at the waterline. And that's important. We have to think about who it is we're going to support to be the leaders of this organization. And the test has to be more than just their congenial people who will follow U.S. lead. Not that that's unimportant, but it also, we want to see, are they people who are admired and respected internationally? Do they have a commanding presence in the sense that they are thinkers and have ideas? Are they prepared to challenge the system in order to find ways through the tough courses? Are they innovative? Are they good administrators? Those kinds of things. All of that, I think, you and I would put down. And, you know, if we were running a company, we'd put down those same lists of qualities and those same ways of working. Or if we were running an NGO or something else. So I think it fits there. It's what I would call good, solidly applied common sense.
Great. Let's go to the back. Eddie?
I'm not allowed to choose your questions in order to keep this perfectly neutral.
UN, NCA. I just want, going back to Security Council, I'd like your comments on the use or possible use by the Security Council under the Rome Treaty of referral of cases to the International Criminal Court, and the possible use of that has been suggested recently in the case of Assad.
Well, I think, Eddie, it's a very interesting idea. Didn't we end up doing that, not blocking that with Bashar in Sudan? And I think it's there to be effectively used in important cases. One wants to do this at a time and under a set of circumstances where you believe that this can make a major positive contribution to the outcome. Telling Assad, while there may still be, but I don't know, room for a negotiated outcome with Kofi Annan's plan might well get in the way of where we are going. Looking at it, however, at the end of the day, where in fact the plan has no legs and there is no more likely step and more pressure has to be brought, it might make a difference. Forgive me for being a little more brutally frank than I usually am by saying that up until now, with the exception of the Balkans and their own tribunals in the main, a good share of what the International Criminal Court has done is to threaten people who eventually use negotiating their way out from under the threat as the way to end a conflict. Now, that's the reverse of the ICC, but in the end, you'll have to judge the results by what can be achieved as much as whether you maintain faith with a particular set of principles having to do with a resolution of part of the problem, but not the whole thing. And this is very hard, but I think we do need to know and understand that the International Criminal Court has had its influence in ways that one way or another may not be totally unhelpful, even if the criminal has escaped justice. Yeah, we'll do one more if that's okay with you. I have to go do a telephone call.
Okay. Let's go over to Mel.
Thank you. Ambassador Pickering, thank you for your wonderful remarks. Mel Boynton from Southern California.
Thank you.
I am your experience and wisdom arising out of the affairs in the Middle East. Would you give us your, if you had a magic wand and could work your will, what would you do in the case of Palestine, Israel?
An easy closer.
I wanted to give you an easy one. Yeah.
I would first have to say there are no such magic wands. And so if I gave you the magic wand answer, it would be totally irrelevant to today. But let me say this. I think that with respect to Palestine, Israel, there are 2 or 3 questions we have to address. The short-term questions are, can we still effectively, in the election year, in the absence of our ability to be helpful with both parties in getting across some kind of negotiating line, avoid the kind of catastrophe that's inherent in what I call the bicycle principle. If you're not riding forward, you may be falling down. And secondly, can we then prepare the way for what, in my view, has to be the opening of a serious process of negotiations? And when we're ready to see a serious process of negotiations, do we have the capacity, perhaps with the quartet, to put together something that goes well beyond the roadmap, but is not a finished treaty by any means? It is what I would call an elaborated set of principles that would say things like borders 1967 with swaps, roughly equivalent quality of territory exchange, those kinds of things. Jerusalem, the capital of both states, the parties to figure out how, in what way, the ancient premises, within the walls at least, is open to free access to all religions and that kind of thing. And these would have 2 very important uses. One would be they would indicate what we will not support. And there are many things around which we should not support with respect to an outcome because they are imbalanced and unfair. One of those is the cantonization of a future Palestinian state. Another is such steps as to make it no longer possible for Israel to be Jewish and democratic. That is, flooding Israel with people who are not Jews, and who may well contest the future of the state of Israel in those terms. My feeling is the second thing it does is it gives the parties at least a structure to work with that can begin to have some of the balance that's necessary as they deal with the questions. The third point is that it does not dictate a solution, but it helps to point the way, and I think that that's very important. That will be very difficult. But it does seem to me that's a hurdle we have to help the parties overcome. In addition to that, we, in my view, I believe should, at least as we are doing now, stay quiet on the efforts of the Palestinians to get together. And maybe we should try to encourage them to get together on a basis that will support the kind of peace settlement that we seek. And we should do everything we can to support any efforts of a government of Israel to move in this common direction as well, because it too has been tortured by the fact that the old coalition was a coalition in one direction only, and it was known to be not a coalition that was wildly enthusiastic about making compromises to establish a Palestinian state, if I can be at least halfway diplomatic. And so I think that those are things that we need to pick up on. And thank you for your question, and the magic wand ain't there.